Hey there, students. All right. Make sure we hear a lot about washing hands now. Marcelino, I am here now. And make sure that you're hydrating. Make sure you're doing generally healthy things, drinking a lot of water. You should be drinking at least a half gallon a day. I mean, I drink more than a gallon a day. Get some sleep. I need to take that advice. Okay. I should be getting more sleep than I do. But think about, in addition to washing your hands. Now, if you haven't washed your hands in like the last 2 hours or so, make sure to go do that no matter whether you need it or not, right? Hey, Raul, good to see you. So you're taking AP Government. I actually met Raul when I was in the Bay Area a couple summers ago. So good to see you here, Raul. And so, yeah, we're going live. And yeah, just today was a very big broadcast schedule because we started on a Tuesday. Now, government's going to be Tuesdays and Thursdays. We might add a third broadcast just depending on if we need more. Usually government's going to be a bit of a smaller audience. So right now, if you go to tomrichey.net/Corona Class, you will see basically the broadcast schedule. Okay, so for right now, at least, I've got 2 broadcasts a week. It's going to be Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And today we're going to be talking about presidential elections. Okay, I was asking people about topics. Now, it doesn't just have to be about that. We can take questions from other topics as well, but let's try to focus on like elections and the political process today. And we'll get into, primaries, we'll get into, the electoral college. And then we've got, when you go and look at the website here, let's see, let me go back to that. So if you go to tomrichey.net/Corona Class, we are going to be focusing on campaigns and elections this week. So I'd like to focus on this time presidential politics, and then on Thursday, looking at campaign finance, PACs, super PACs, and the Citizens United case. Okay, so we'll take a look at the Citizens United case. Now, next week, we can talk about the federal judiciary and Supreme Court cases. So let's hold off on judiciary and Supreme Court cases until next week. Now, then we will look at, on week 3, we'll focus on some foundational documents, the Federalist Papers, and then the Declaration of Independence, letter from Birmingham jail. Now, again, I may end up adding some more broadcasts, but these are the ones that I can definitely promise for AP Government. So we're going to be doing Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern. Now, also, sessions are going to be archived. So if you can't make it with here live, then you will be able to look at the archive session. Okay, so you don't have to make it here at the live session. All right, Sadle's class, Sadle, I tell you, it's a written test, but I try to get these things right as much as I can. All right, so with that, Thursday, we're going to be focusing on campaign finance. So I'm going to mostly, focus on, let's see what kind of questions y'all are asking and go from there, okay? So let's see what our questions are, and go in here and you can upvote questions. Okay, so Kevin wants a dab. Now remember, the World Health Organization has actually recommended dabbing. Okay, when you cough or sneeze. Okay, when you cough or sneeze, just dab on it. Okay, so think about that. Now, as far as that goes, school's on a block schedule. So yeah, we're going to, the thing is, Madison, about AP Government, now I'm teaching on a semester as well. It's not linear like APUSH or AP Euro, AP World, the history classes that y'all are really welcome to. I mean, we can be flexible here because we've got less than 100 people in here. If you've got questions, ask them. If you can stay away from topics that that I'm going to focus on in other sessions, let's do it like that. I'm not going to say that you have to limit your questions to presidential politics, but let's note that the questions, the more specific they are, the better. Now, another thing to kind of note here is teachers. I know there are some teachers in here. If there are some things that you would like for me to go over that would be helpful to your students, then go ahead and put that out there. Ask me to talk about whatever subject you want. Usually the more guidance I can get, because again, AP government's not strictly speaking linear, okay? Like it's not like we go from here to here or something like that. So go ahead and get me some things there. Now, how long is the class? These classes will last somewhere between 1 hour and 2 hours. It's kind of like, when you're watching a show on Netflix or HBO or something like that, that when we're looking at those, and if y'all can do those as questions and not in the chat, those will be most helpful to me. So this is basically as long as it needs to be. It'll typically be between 1 and 2 hours anytime this goes live. Okay, so as far as that goes, now what we see here is, Elizabeth, you're asking about voting and voter behavior. Now, here are a few things that I want to focus on. I've got a video on my YouTube channel that focuses on party identification. I don't think it would be a bad idea to go ahead and bring that out here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and find my slides for my party identification video. I don't know why they're not coming up. Let's see, AP. Whoa. Okay, let me just run in here. I think I'm going to have to search here manually. Okay, go do it the old-fashioned way. That I'm going to have to open up my AP government folder and then go into parties and election. And yes. Okay, so let's go into, first of all, if we think about one aspect of voter behavior, that would be party identification. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and I'm going to get the slides going. And let's make sure also, let's try to hit the whoa. Let's try to keep the chat clean. Let's try not to clutter the chat, spam the chat, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so with that, let me go ahead, and we are sharing the screen now, and going to talk quickly about party identification. Now, typically, what do we want to think about? In what ways do people identify with political parties, and also what factors influence party preference? Okay, so a few things here that a lot of times we think about. There are Democrats, there are Republicans, and there are independents. But we need to get a little bit deeper than that, okay? Because when it comes down to it, now I'm not sure when this was taken, but it's about, when it comes down to it, only a very small majority of people, at least according to the data that I was using at this time, that a very small majority of people openly identify with a party. Like 45% of people in this poll said they were independents. But what we want to note here is that even though nearly half of the electorate self-identifies as independent, we want to note that in the 2012 election, for example, 98.3% voted for one of the two major party candidates. So, which means that less than 2% of the country is truly independent from our two-party system. Now, when we look at 2016, I think the number was closer to 5%. But when you think about this, when you look at 2016, where you had Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and I don't think that I can think of an election in recent memory. If someone wants to correct me on this, we're certainly teachers, feel free. But when you've got two candidates with as high of negatives as Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had, like both candidates are disliked by a majority of the country when you ask them point blank. And still, 95% of Americans voted the ones that voted at least, voted for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. So when you think about that when people are a lot more partisan than they're going to admit. So we need to think about how do people express their party preference. So we've really got like 4 different criteria that we can use here. Okay, so first of all, the most obvious criteria is that you have registered to vote as a Democrat or a Republican. Now, in some states, like my home state of South Carolina, we don't have partisan voter registration. And that's one thing I want to review getting into open primaries, closed primaries. South Carolina is an open primary state without partisan identification. In South Carolina, you don't register to vote as a Democrat or a Republican. So that can favor state by state. Now, then the next thing, you may not be registered as a certain party, but you may identify yourself that way. So in South Carolina, there are plenty of people, like a majority of South Carolina voters, identify themselves as Republicans. So even if they're not registered, they're still self-identifying. Now, the third one is where we see, when I look at that 98.3% number from 2012, when we think about a tendency to support candidates, okay? So when it comes down to it, on Election Day 2012, 47.2% of the voters identified as Republican by supporting the Republican nominee, whereas 51% of the voters identified as Democratic because they supported President Obama. So either the party's candidates or the party's policies, okay? So if somebody, for example, they might not be crazy about President Trump, but they may say that I generally support the Republican Party's policies. So there are voters who would say, while I may not personally approve of Donald Trump, I do like that Republican policies about taxes and the judiciary. So, that's something that you see there. So a tendency to support a party. So, for example, the policies, when we think about like gun rights versus gun control, these are, if somebody tends to support the Second Amendment and gun rights, they are more than likely a Republican in some way or another. I'm sure there's a tendency to support Republican candidates, whereas somebody who strongly favors gun control is going to, they are supporting a Democratic Party position. So when you take into account, the positions that somebody has, do they tend to go Democratic or Republican? Now, the fourth one is by voting, okay? Voting in primary elections, okay? So in South Carolina, you basically, even though there's an open primary, when you go and you choose to vote in the Republican primary, then you are identifying as a Republican. So, for example, when we have candidates in South Carolina, for example, it's like a one-party state. Let's think about Federalist 10, okay? I can't mention Federalist 10 enough. Those of you who are teachers, like, I don't know if you, like me, you get kind of blue in the face because you're like, okay, what's Federalist 10 about? And it's like two things: small republics versus large republics, and factions. Now, South Carolina is an example of what James Madison was writing about in Federalist 10, where there is a faction that controls the government. That good luck running for statewide office in South Carolina as a Democrat. Good luck carrying the state in a presidential contest as a Democrat. South Carolina is a thoroughly Republican state, that the Republican faction controls the state government. So what'll happen is there are people in a state like this, and in some Democratic states, they'll do the same thing, except they are with the other party, is that if you want to get elected, you're going to have to run as a Republican. And so there are people sometimes who run as a Republican, and you'll see in attack ads and attack mailers that this person who's running as a Republican either contributed to Democratic candidates in the past, or they have in the past, like, 20 years voted in a Democratic primary. So when we look at all of that, now, of course, in South Carolina, somebody could have voted in the last 4 elections, and they might have voted in 1 Democratic primary and 3 Republican primaries. So, and in that case, we would probably say that person is what we call a Republican leaner. Okay, so when we think about this, leaners, you want to consider that there are strong Republicans, strong Democrats. There are, leaning Republicans, leaning Democrats, and then there's also the independent that really doesn't have much to do with the party other than voting for their candidates. So some independents, like when we think about independent voters, some of them lean left, others lean right, okay? And when you look at the Democratic contest, for example, when you look at, the Democrats seem to be very, very intent on stopping Bernie Sanders, even though Bernie Sanders is very popular within the Democratic Party. But what you see there during some of the debates that we've seen is that there is a concern that, what is going to be the effect of, on independent voters who may lean a little left. They may have a tendency to support the Democratic Party, and certainly the Democratic establishment seems to think that in this election cycle, it's better to find a nominee who leans left, okay, because they're looking to connect. When we look at presidential politics, connecting with those independent voters is key. Now, another thing when we're looking at voter behavior is this person who leans left, okay, so they're usually going to be less likely to vote in an election if there is an independent, not necessarily that partisan, tends to favor the Democratic Party on a good day. It's like, maybe it's they've got things that they'd rather do besides vote, or they're like, what, I'm not excited about that candidate. So that's something. So in elections we have differing turnouts depending on who is excited. Now, of course, if Joe Biden is nominated by the Democrats, there may be some Bernie Sanders supporters that decide that they're not going to vote. Like, for example, in 2016, I think the data that I was looking at from 2016 is about 83% of people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary voted for the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, whereas about 10% of them didn't vote, and about 7% of them voted for Trump. So this is something that, you see the dynamics there when you're dealing with all of these different people that have to be reached in presidential politics. So with that, people tend to choose a party when it's crunch time. So again, voter registration, self-identification, a tendency to support a party, or voting in primary elections. So when we look at the complex version of this, we're seeing that, people do identify with a party. Now, what I mean about weak Republicans, now a strong Republican is a straight ticket voter. Now, when we're talking about voter behavior, we want to understand that partisanship is not the only thing people consider, and some people don't consider partisanship at all when voting. Partisanship's not as important as it used to be, but it is still the most important consideration when people vote. Okay, so in a general election, there are going to be more people who make the decision about who they're going to vote for based on the political party than about the candidate's individual merits or about the policies that, so a strong Republican is someone who backs a Republican candidate no matter what. Now, a weak Democrat, this would be somebody who normally votes Democratic, but is willing to support Republican candidates in some cases. Okay, so they've got some flexibility in who they support. And when we look at the leaners, these are the people who they don't identify, they don't self-identify as Democrat or Republican, but they tend to support that party's candidate. So that's what we're looking at when we look at voter behavior. Now, another thing we want to note is what determines how you vote. And one thing that's very important here is that, and by the way, these Corona classes will be posted to my YouTube channel. I've just got one from earlier from Euro. So note that if you can't make one of these live, you will be able to go to my YouTube channel and see that. All right. So, and you can also come back here to Crowdcast. Crowdcast will have them archived through the exam. So when we look at this, your parents are the most influential in determining your political affiliation. Like, for example, if you grew up in a household where both of your parents were Democrats, then you are about 2-to-1 more likely to support the Democratic Party into adult life. Now, does that always matter? No, but it's important to note that when we think of the process, this is what we call now. One thing I always tell people on these things, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, great book, great movie. Okay, but that's not what this is. Make sure that you've got a writing utensil and a piece of paper in front of you. So when I say terms like political socialization, that you know what I'm talking about here. The political socialization is this process by which we become introduced to politics. And so our parents have a very strong role in determining the way that we think about politics, like the issues that are important to us. For example, when I was growing up, I was able to learn when I was, like 8 years old or so, that taxes are an important voting issue. That was my political socialization, that, when you go to vote, what you should be most concerned about is taxes. And there are other people who learn different things from their parents, that it's, it may be, some people focus on fiscal issues. That's what I was, that's how I was socialized. Other people, look at social issues. Whatever their parents said was important, a lot of times that really like uncritical 6-year-old brain is taking that in. Now, understand though that sometimes, why is it that 30 to 35% go a different way? Because your experience matters. Let's say that you grew up in rural Nebraska and you end up living in New York City. You're going to, and also when you go into a profession, for example, that's something to take into account as well, that when, there are people who their profession's going to matter. Their friendship group is going to matter. Especially in our polarized environment today, when we talk about political polarization, kind of like the North Pole and the South Pole, okay? Like, your teachers can probably tell you that, which I, when I was growing up in the 1990s, you could, it wasn't a problem to have like if you were a Republican and to have friends who were Democrats. It wasn't odd, even though now as things have gotten more polarized, we see that there are people who may change their political views for social acceptability because they don't want to be ostracized by their peer group. So that's something. Experience matters. Now, also, we want to note that people get more attached with time. So when somebody's older, if they've been voting Republican all their life, unless there is, I'm going to talk in a second about realignment, but typically somebody who's voted Republican all their life, they will keep voting Republican later. Now, while we're on this, we want to remember that older people are much more likely to vote than younger people. Now, that's something that we want to take into account when you're analyzing the Democratic primary, for example. Now, let's think about this. Let me chat with y'all for a second. Which candidate, when we think about Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, okay, when we think about Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, which candidate energizes younger voters more? Okay, who energizes? Let's go ahead. You know what? Let me go ahead and create a poll. Okay, who energizes younger voters more? Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Who has energized younger voters? I need to remember to put that on a poll. And y'all this should be a pretty easy poll, right? Okay, we got 60 people in here. Okay, good. I've got some more voters. Yeah, so when it comes down to it, which this is a great example. We got 60 people in here and only 20 voters. Now, I know some of y'all are watching on mobile. That might be a little bit of a difficulty there. But the thing is that, yeah, I mean, obviously, like Bernie Sanders has much more appeal to young people. Now, what are the Democratic Party leaders thinking, though? Like, what is risky about a Bernie Sanders? What are they seeing from their perspective? Now, keep in mind that, we're looking at different perspectives here, and some of you may disagree with some of these perspectives. So if we're looking at what the Democratic Party leaders, okay, so looking at that, so going into that, what do you think their concern is? Okay, I mean, Bernie's like very popular with young people. Y'all go ahead and type for me. And if anybody wants to go on camera, young, what? Okay. So with that, the thing is that, younger voters are much less likely to vote. Like the under 30 demographic is the least likely to participate in elections. And so that's something that when people are thinking about about a nominee, they want that. So when we see that, so what we see here that he will, oh, thank you. I don't need anything yet, but thank you. Yeah. So, well, and that's the other thing here when we think about like, polarization and the party process, the nominating process. Okay. So when we look at the primaries, candidates who have more extreme positions tend to do better, right, in the primaries. But in the general election, the thing is about winning moderates. Now, the other side of that is that Joe Biden, if he's nominated, will have some trouble connecting with People who are more passionate. Now, that's another thing. People who tend to be most passionate and most active, when we talk about activists, those tend to be people with more extreme opinions. Okay, so okay, and you could see that. Yeah, there definitely is, Raul. Now, of course, articles we read are always, into like wishful thinking, but at the same time, like Bernie and Trump are both populists. Okay, so when you think about that, about 7 to 10% of people who supported Bernie in the primary last time went for Donald Trump, and you could see a very similar thing, that there could be voters who feel that their vote didn't add up to anything, political efficacy. All right, so so Andrew Yang, I actually got to meet Andrew Yang. I happened to be in the Atlanta airport in November at the same time as he was. I was like, is that Andrew Yang? And it was like his handler's like, yeah, that was Andrew Yang. So let's talk a bit about realignment. Okay, realignment, that is a shifting of a coalition in a party. So every party has its coalitions that they put together. And what we see now, for example, in 1932, those of you who've had AP US history, and you might have encountered this in government. In 1932, you had a massive realignment as people started to switch allegiance from the Republican to the Democratic Party. And so parties will put together coalitions that will last a while. Now, if you look at the current, I think we are in the middle of a realignment. Okay, realignment means that is when people decide that I have supported this party in the past, but now I'm going to support that party. Okay, and there's usually a reason for that. So if you think about this, that Trump has taken in to the Republican Party working class whites, blue collar whites, white voters with less than a college education. Now, these voters, when you look 40 years ago, these voters formed the backbone of the Democratic Party. Now, a lot of these voters liked Reagan. They liked Nixon. They liked Reagan. But then when the Democratic Party put up somebody like Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton, they tended to get the votes of these working class whites. And Trump has brought those people into the Republican coalition. Now, what we've seen happen, though, is that the Republican Party, throughout most of my lifetime, has had a corner on college-educated white voters. Now, when we think about education, you've got, high school, college, and then graduate degrees. Now, the Democratic Party for a long time has had people who have, graduate degrees, but Republicans used to have a majority of the voters that had white voters with a college degree. And that is no longer the case. Like, there is a realignment there. Now, see, that's the thing when you're taking a look at the Democrats and they're thinking about, do we want to risk, nominating Bernie, even though he makes people very excited that what happens with these, with these moderate suburban whites, is that going to push them back to Trump? Now, one thing to note as well, like what you want to do for this exam, they're going to throw charts and graphs and figures at you. They're never going to give you anything that's not true. So the more you can memorize about trends that people, trends in voting and voter behavior. So, for example, if you understand that women are slightly more likely to vote Democratic than men, so, white males are more likely to vote Republican than white females. Now, at the same time, majority of white females voted Republican in the last presidential election, 53%. Now, with white voters in the current coalition, when you look at 2016, that Donald Trump did better among voters who lacked an education. Now, the thing is, when you look at Latino voters and African American voters who vote Republican, those voters tend to have more education than voters in those demographics that are voting Democratic. So it's important that when you look at all of that demographic information, that you start to think about, like, okay, that's how do older voters vote? You think about age, race and ethnicity, education, gender. All of those things are important in terms of, dealing with how people vote and forecasting voter behavior. Okay, so going from there, we got some yang gang in here. Okay, great. So voter behavior, I did hit the whoa. Now remember, you can upvote questions. Okay, you can upvote questions. Now the AP exams online, let's wait on all that. I'm going to do some other broadcasts. I'll be telling y'all I've got some broadcasts coming up the next couple days with Marco Learning that we are going to talk about some of this stuff. Now the Corona classes, let's try to keep those content oriented. Like I'm trying to keep these to where we are preparing for the exam. So let's keep these questions on exam content or the nature of the exam and stuff like that. And let's not worry about while we're here. Now, there will be other broadcasts that I'm going to tell y'all about soon. Like just make sure you're following me on Instagram, on Twitter, on my social media, because I'm going to be putting out when I'm doing other broadcasts. But the Corona classes I'm trying to keep these content oriented. Okay, now Thames versus Indiana. You know what? I am not familiar with that case. So let me just take a quick look at that. Now, it's not one of the 15, but I guess the question would be, which one of the 15 might this be compared to? Okay, so let me go ahead and take a look at this case just because somebody said here, okay, the applicability of the excessive fines clause. Okay. I don't necessarily think that, when I'm looking at this, I don't see something right in now also this is the Roberts Court, we don't hear about this a lot of times, but the Roberts Court, this is a unanimous decision. Like there are no dissenting opinions here. So this is something that, I would not expect this to come up, especially also since the 2019 case. But I don't see anything right there, right looking at it, that I'm thinking this would be compared with a case that's currently on there. So I would not think that case is something you would have to worry about for the exam. All right. So when we look there, is it worth? You know what? I think that's Mark. That's an interesting kind of point here. That just because somebody's independent doesn't mean that they're moderate. That's one thing that when you look at Bernie Sanders, for example, he's running for the Democratic. Okay, so it's a selective incorporation case, Raul, but at the same time, tons of cases that we've got are selective incorporation cases. So I don't see that one being something that comes up. Now watch that be, come up on there and people can laugh at me later, right? But so let's not think that, independents are necessarily moderates. Okay, that's interesting. Now, I don't know, Mark, how much that would really factor into a survey level course, but it definitely is a good observation and something that could be helpful for you on a free response. Okay, and so let's see, Kalia, can you elaborate on your question a little bit about conventional and unconventional political participation? That's something that, it's not sticking out for me right there, but at the same time, we can talk about this. Okay, so let's see, Kane. All right, so we're going to go into primaries versus caucuses. Okay, so let me go ahead. We've got kind of a small group here. Let me go ahead and let's see. I'm going to go in here and create something here. I'm going to create a Google Doc so that I can put some stuff in front of you. So let's see. Okay, so let me go ahead and create this. It's going to take just a second. It says it's working, allegedly. This would be a good time for y'all to wash your hands. Oh, that was creating a folder, not, let's see, so Corona Class, let's see. And then I'm about to share this with y'all, and it's going to be a read only, but y'all have access to this. And actually, you know what? I'm just going to share my screen for probably for the first bit. But let's see. Okay. Looking for a tutoring session that I did recently. Okay. So so I've got something here that when we look at caucuses versus primaries, I'm about to share my screen with you. Okay. So when we think about this, then let me go into, let's see, caucus or primary. And then I've got something also on open primaries and closed primaries. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what I'm looking at. All right, just had to go into some old notes for a second. So let's go in here. Okay, so caucus versus primary. Now, basically, a caucus is an evening meeting. Like instead of going to vote, now a primary election is basically just like a general election that people show up at the polls open, the polls close. And that's basically, you go and you vote. Now, primary elections are run by the state. Okay, so the state election commission. Okay, just like a general election. Okay, so basically, when you have a primary, it is state officials that are running an election, whereas a caucus is run by the party. Okay, it is run by the party. The state has nothing to do with it. So when you look at, for example, there was a lot of uproar about the Iowa caucuses, where the Democratic Party was using an app. The state of Iowa had nothing to do with that. Like the Iowa Commissioner of Elections has nothing to do with that. Now, if you go to a caucus, like what happens is you show up and representatives of every campaign give speeches. And then after people have heard the speeches, they will vote. Okay, they've heard the speeches and they'll cast their votes. Now, you'll notice here, that this, let's see, and a few others. Okay, that we would look here, and these states. Now, when you look at these states, what they have in common is they tend to be smaller states west of the Mississippi. Okay, like you see, it's predominantly, when we see here, predominantly rural states west of the Mississippi River. Okay, so that's one thing that we kind of see here. And caucuses, they appeal to activists. Okay, that basically when there's a caucus, because people have to take like they basically give up an evening, candidates with enthusiastic support are going to do better than candidates that don't have enthusiastic supporters. So somebody could say that it results in informed decision making, right? More informed decision making, but it does exclude people who are not willing to give up several hours of their time. And so that's where, like, if a party had nothing but caucuses, the caucus system has been widely criticized. Like, I would question whether the caucuses, I think next time around we may see less caucuses. We definitely see less caucuses than we saw 20 years ago, because this day and age, people are getting more and more jealous of their time. And so I think that we're going to see less caucuses as we go forward. And caucuses may eventually just cease to exist. But then again, we have to note that these rural states west of the Mississippi, they have their own kind of political culture. And so, somebody who has an enthusiastic base of support, they're able to do very well in a caucus. Whereas a primary is just, it involves a lower commitment. And the thing is that people who are critics of caucuses, they say that in a general election, voters aren't necessarily big, politically committed people, that the activists are not the people who decide elections, that the people who vote in a primary election, they represent a very small amount of people. So, a presidential election, like when we think about the elections and in terms of how many people vote, the presidential election will usually have a majority of the eligible voters. Now, note that even in a presidential election, 4 out of 10 people in this country don't even vote in that election. And so then you have a an off-year election. Okay, so for example, like when states have elections in 2018 or 2022, and that's also, remember, the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate is elected every 2 years. So these elections, the what are called the midterm elections, where there's not a presidential race going on, that turnout is lower than in a presidential election year. And then when we look at primaries, the turnout is much lower because the only people that vote in primary elections are the people who tend to identify with a party. Whereas, in general elections, a lot of people just see that as kind of an obligation, a civic duty, so to speak. And that's something that is a bit different in that sense about the way people look at it. A lot of people think I don't need to vote in a primary election, or I'm not required to vote in a special election. Okay, like when we have special elections, those are even lower. And so then we have, states like the next thing is you've got the caucus and the primary. Now, the next question is whether there is an open primary or a closed primary. Okay, so when we're looking at an open primary, any registered voter can vote. South Carolina is an open primary state. But they can't now in the same election, you can't vote in both parties' primaries. Okay, you can only vote in one, but you go into this with when you go to an open primary, you are voting for that party, but you don't have to be. When you think about, is this person a Republican? They're just like, hey, I want to vote in the Republican primary. They're not necessarily involved in the Republican in the Republican Party. So if we think about this, that when we think about an open primary, on one hand, it is more inclusive. Okay, it is more inclusive. Open to independents. Okay, so independents, and even open to people who identify with the other party, right? So on one hand, it's more inclusive, but on the other hand, it gives the party less control over the nominating process, which you may see as a good or a bad thing. Oh, it'll stop. It'll click. Oh. Thanks for helping me. All right, so it gives the party less control over the nominating process, that basically people are just coming in and deciding about that. Now, you could also have, like, technically, when there's an open primary, you can have Republicans who could vote strategically. Now, this research doesn't show that this happens a whole lot, okay? But technically, a Republican could decide, I'm going to go in and I'm going to vote for the person that I think is going to be the weakest candidate. I'm going to go support them so that they are more likely to get the nomination. I don't think most people have time for that, okay? But it can happen, okay? But the bottom line is, whether it's Republicans who want to go troll the Democratic primary, or whether it's independents who are voting in good faith, it still gives the party less control over the nominating process. Okay, so, whereas with a closed primary, that is where you've got, a state like Pennsylvania that has partisan voting registration, and you're voting as a, thank you. You're voting, you have to register for that party in order to vote in the primary. For example, in 2016, only one of Donald Trump's children was able to vote for him in the New York Republican primary, because only Don Jr. was registered as a Republican. Ivanka and Eric were not registered as Republicans and were not able to vote in the New York Republican primary. So the thing is, on one hand, that it is not open to as many people. Okay, so it is closed to independent participation. Okay, so that's one thing we think about the closed primary, but at the same time, it gives the party more control, okay, over the nominating process, because the people who are participating in a closed primary are people who have declared themselves to be members of that party. So that's one thing that's very important in primary elections. Okay, so with this, a link to the Google Doc. Yeah, we've got a smaller group in here. Sometimes when I give the link when I'm working on it, that's something that, you know, people just end up getting in there and trolling it. But we've got a small group here, so I think we're going to be fine. So let's go ahead and share that link with you. Now, Louisiana, actually, what we need to note about Louisiana is actually a what they call a blanket primary. That's something that's probably not going to come up on this exam. Those of you who are teachers, do you get into so as far as that goes, do you get into blanket primaries, or do you just go into like open and closed primaries? Let's see. So we'll see if we find, yeah, but I tend to focus on, you know, open and closed primaries. Now this should be, let me see if I can just make sure that anybody can view. Okay, so let me see here. Yeah, this should be set up to where anybody with the link can view. Okay. So as far as that goes, let's see. So yeah, when it comes down to it, let's see. Okay, let's see if that link is going to do that. Okay, so with that, all right. Yeah, so blanket primaries are basically like where they have a primary election, and think about just a blanket being thrown over all the candidates that, you know, so jungle primary is something that people talk about. Now, you know, as far as that goes, did Louisiana switch their primary? See, because I'm from Louisiana. Now, I've been out of Louisiana for over a decade, but have they changed their primary? Because the jungle primary, where it was just like the top two, like everybody's on one ballot and the top two end up going into a runoff. That's something that is, you know, but very few states do that. In most cases, you've got an open primary or a closed primary. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and, okay, so okay, so Louisiana has to see, because the roots of that jungle primary, so-called, was when the Democratic Party, you know, had, you know, like a 2-to-1 advantage in terms of voting, you know, of voters, and the Republicans would have their primary and their nominee would be unscathed. I think it might have been 1980 or so when Train was elected governor, and I think he was the first Republican governor in the 20th century in Louisiana. So now that Louisiana is a Republican, you know, a solidly Republican state, of course, with the Democratic governor. Okay, so if Louisiana has become a closed primary state, it's not really worth talking about the other primaries anymore. So as far as that goes, yeah, going into open primaries, closed primaries. Now, let's see if we've got any other questions. Now, iron triangles. Hip Hughes has a great iron triangle video where he goes over that. So I think that would be good just to kind of let that stand there. But basically, as far as that goes, you think about like the, you know, it's a combination of the bureaucracy, of the politician, and basically what is expected of that politician. So let me just go into the graphic here, since somebody's asking. You know, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so as we go into there, but again, Hip Hughes has a good explanation of this. So let me go ahead and just put this up here, and we can chat about it, because it did get 15 upvotes, so it's clearly something that y'all want to go over. Okay, so let's go ahead and, okay, excellent. Mark has put a link to Hip Hughes' video where he does that. So as far as that goes, the bureaucracy. Now, somebody mentioned the bureaucracy a little while ago. And when we talk about the bureaucracy, these are people protected by civil service. Okay, these are people protected by civil service, and basically, even if there's a change in who's in charge, so there's a new party that's the governor or the president, that even with that, these people keep their jobs. And so the interest group, there's an interest group that says, hey, we're voting for you, okay, for this office. And then once that Congress gets in there, once that Congressperson gets in there, then they are expected to vote in a way that pleases that interest group. And they're also giving money to bureaucratic institutions. So for example, I think that, it's worth picking on ourselves a little bit as teachers. Okay. Now let me see what people's roles are. Let me just see how many teachers, what is your role? Okay. So teacher and student. Just see how many teachers we've got in here. Yeah. Yeah, it's good to get some sunlight. Need to get some sunlight. Stay away from that coronavirus. Okay, that's another good thing. Make sure you go outside and that you are, y'all get some sunlight. Okay, so when we think about this, when we think about like teachers, for example, we got a few teachers in here. One thing that I find really amusing, okay, let's think about, and teachers, y'all feel free to chime in here, that, one of the things I got, and South Carolina is not even a strong like teachers union state. Carolina, oh, bring Bonnie with you. Yeah. So as far as that goes, you want to, when we think about this, so Wendy, what state are you in? I just want to see what states people are in. I'm in South Carolina, which is not even a strong teachers union state, but I've been told that basically I'm not reporting to work for the next 2.5 weeks, probably more than that. But we're not going to work for 2.5 weeks. But one of the things in the email was like, are we going to get paid? Okay, so are teachers going to get paid? And it's like, of course teachers are going to get paid. Okay, that's so one thing here, we think about the teachers and, of course teachers are going to get paid. Because the thing is, what if the legislature said that, teachers are going to go home for 2.5 weeks, but we're not going to pay them. Okay, we're not going to pay them. That could be a very bad thing at the polls. Okay, so what happened, for example, if we think about Kentucky? Okay, like last election cycle, like 2019, there was a gubernatorial election in Kentucky. Kentucky is a very Republican state. And they had a Republican governor who picked a few too many fights with the teachers. My friend, who's a Republican political consultant, said that this governor in Kentucky, he messed up on 2 counts. Not only did he pick fights with current teachers, but he picked fights with retired teachers. Now, go ahead and think about that. Teachers are more likely to vote than other people in the electorate, okay? So teachers are college educated. They tend, in the education profession, civic responsibility is a very, big emphasized thing. And so teachers vote, and especially retired teachers, because they don't work anymore and they're older. So retired teachers are going to get out there and vote. And so when you think about this, like, when teachers support a candidate, for example, then that candidate gets into office and knows that they depend on the teacher votes in order to, remain in office. And so when you tick off teachers or you don't give funding, so here's the thing, if I were running for office and I've got a very teacher-friendly platform and I know that like 80% of teachers are voting for me, then when I get into office, what's going to happen when I'm asked, do you favor pay raises for teachers? Let's say I'd run for governor or something like that, and the legislature passes a piece of legislation that gives teachers a generous pay raise. Am I going to sign that, or am I going to veto it? And let's think about as well, what if I knew that this pay raise for teachers, what if I knew that this pay raise for teachers was going to put the state in a bad financial situation? Okay, so the thing is, though, what are politicians thinking about more than anything else? They're thinking about that they are going to, they thinking about getting reelected. So when it comes down to it, if I counted on the teachers to get in, then so California, let's see, got to the brink of the strike. Yeah, so that's the thing, that like teachers, like even teachers who are Republicans are going, and that's why you find that there are certain like education issues. Like South Carolina is a very, very Republican state. it's not a very strong teachers union state, but at the same time, they're not like, you don't see any politician in either party saying like, hey, I mean, you think about it from a pure equity standpoint, it might make sense to, for pay to be cut to some extent, but no, 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 that's not going to go over politically. So with that, interesting to see different situations here because, yeah, in South Carolina, one of the things that was in that email we got was, am I going to get paid? Yes, you are going to get paid. This is not going to impact teacher pay. So when you look at the iron triangle, it's like, okay, so the teachers unions are supporting this candidate. And then we see that, all right, well, this candidate's going to support funding for education. This candidate is going to support legislation that's popular with teachers. Now, also, when, things like in South Carolina, for example, I think that the legislature is considering right now a teachers' bill of rights, okay, which they're either considering or they might have voted on it recently. Louisiana, for example, I know they have a teachers' bill of rights. So that's an example there. Now, also, when we think about, for example, the interest group that contributes the most is going to be the pharmaceutical industry. So when the pharmaceutical industry is giving electoral support for people in Congress in both parties, and then when it comes down to it, let's say the FDA, okay? So what happens here is, let's say that there's going to be somebody that's being appointed to a seat on the FDA. And so an FDA director is going to be appointed. Well, these people who relied on the pharmaceutical industry, they are going to ask, these lobbyists from the interest groups of the pharmaceutical industry, is this person who's up for this spot on the FDA, is this person okay with you? Okay. Is this person going to give low regulations and special favors? Because what happens if the interest group, the pharmaceutical industry puts this person in Congress, and this person in Congress says something like, hey, you know what? The federal government buys so many prescription medications that they should pay bulk, the federal government shouldn't pay retail for that kind of stuff. Well, the pharmaceutical industries who give so much money to candidates, they've got another thing to say. I mean, when you think about it in terms of how it affects policy, I mean, this is one of those things that, President Trump campaigned on, which, a lot of Democrats have campaigned on, and nothing happens. Like this whole idea that we should, like the federal government should get a discount when buying pharmaceuticals in bulk for Medicare and Medicaid, but they're paying retail. This makes absolutely no sense if you think about the United States as a democracy, right? But then when you think about interest group politics, then yes, okay, so you think about, well, why did the FDA do this? Like, for example, when you think about, I forget if that was federal or California, but for example, like, would most people, okay, let's think about this, okay? I'm going to ask y'all a little question here that would you like to know, okay? Let's think about this. We're going to, let's see. And yeah, that's interesting to hear how some places with strong teachers unions actually have like a more hostile climate for teachers than, places like my state. That's fascinating. So as far as that, because I think even teacher pay in South Carolina, when the cost of living's factored in, I think South Carolina, like when you index it with cost of living, is like a very good teacher pay state, in comparison with other states. And I think the pay is even going up again. But that's because even though this is a Republican state, teachers are very active politically. And so when we think about this, I was, gosh, I forget the poll that oh yeah. So what was that? Gosh, my train of thought. I started reading something and lost my train of thought. So with that, yeah. So here's the thing: if you were, would you want to know if you were buying cloned meat? Okay. So I'm going to ask, would you like to know? Okay, if you are buying cloned meat. Let's see what y'all say here. So, you're at the grocery store and you're buying steak. Okay. Would you want to know this came from a cloned animal? Do you feel like you have a right to that information? Okay. So here's the thing, like overwhelmingly, when you ask citizens, like, should I, now we got one person doesn't care. I mean, if it's cloned, it's just like the other one, right? But when we look at this, it looks like there's an overwhelming majority of you that would prefer to know that you're buying cloned meat. Now, what does the food industry have to say about that? Okay, so let's think about this. Does the food industry, okay, want you to know if you are buying cloned meat? Okay, so let's see about this. Let's see what y'all have to say about that. Does the food industry want you to know if you're buying cloned meat? See what y'all have to say. Okay, so what we see here is when it comes down to like regulations, okay, when we see something like this where there is a conflict between, now the thing is, some of you may buy cloned meat, but you just want to know, right? Oh, interesting. Okay, thanks, Mark. That's going to be interesting to look at. So where do they, that'd be interesting to see where they have let's see. So New York, where does South Carolina fit in on that? Okay, so South Carolina is like not necessarily like the worst there. Okay, now this is the average. Okay, so by cost. Okay, so when we look at cost of living by state, and then we combine the two of them. So when we go there, okay, so Michigan and Illinois. They actually get the best. Pennsylvania's doing pretty well there. So yeah, New York is actually still in the top 10, but not the first by any means. Okay, I'm just gonna take a quick look at this. North Carolina. Okay, so. Oh, South Carolina still okay. But then again, we notice that when you look at the middle, like it's most of them there. Okay. Fascinating. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting thing to look at. Thanks for sharing that. So as far as that goes, when we look at the iron triangle, that's what you want to think about, like in terms of an interest group basically has control over these Congress people. Okay, so another thing to think about as well is when you think about, like, for example, the gun issue, like on both sides people are very, very passionate, but at the same time, people are, whether it's on one side or the other of the gun debate, an interest group is putting these people into office. Okay, and then of course, whatever faction is dominating is going to is going to try to favor the policies of that interest group. So that's another thing we're thinking about Federalist 10 and the emphasis on factions. Okay, so with that, going into that was a good thing there. Now, key elections. Okay, when we think about key elections, I would say that 1932 would be a big key election. Now, one thing, teachers, y'all feel free to chime in. I don't necessarily see like the key elections as being a key, a key component. I see what I did there. A key component on this exam. But 1932, I think, would be the best example of 1932. That's very nice of you to say, Madison. So 1932 would be a great example of a key election, like a realignment election. So, for example, just to kind of show you how this sort of thing works. Okay, so the way we're going to define a key election, we'll just put U.S. Okay, so that's just okay. So I'm just going to go straight to 1928. Presidential election. Okay, so let's take a look here. Now, 1928, this was a period of Republican dominance over presidential politics. Okay, so you see here where now this is Al Smith was the first Catholic nominee of a major party, which is probably one of the reasons. Now, two reasons for Hoover's election. First of all, Calvin Coolidge had been very popular. The economy was great. But then also Al Smith was a Catholic. You see here where, he got votes in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which are heavily Catholic states. But at the same time, you actually see, because of the economy and a Catholic nominee on the Democratic side, you see that all but like the deep South states here are voting Republican. Now, when you go before this, okay, if we were going to go to 1924, when Calvin Coolidge was elected president, we see here that basically the former Confederate States of America, if you include Oklahoma as a Confederate territory, it's basically the Civil War all over again. Now, of course, you've got Lafayette in Wisconsin on the progressive side, but you see here where the country is decisively Republican. And then so you go to 1928. Now, before that, you had the 1920 election. And just to see how that went, very, very similar, except, a few states, you've got like 3 states voting different. So you see here, Republicans, now note here, 60% to 34%. Okay, so overwhelming support for the Republican Party. 54%. Now that's even with, this is one thing to note here, that, Lafayette was a progressive Republican, like he had been a So when we look at his information there, that when we look at political party, so he was a Republican and was a progressive Republican. So you see here where the Democratic nominee only got 28% of the vote. So then in 1928, very, very similar, like the Democrats can't seem to get past that 40% threshold. So when we look at 1932, we see that 1932 was a major realignment. You see here where where FDR is getting 57% to 39%, and the Republican Party is only really holding on to its stronghold in the Northeast. Okay, so, a few states in the Northeast. So this is what we would know as a key election. Now, think about this too, that you're going to see the Democratic Party dominate presidential politics for a long time. Because of this New Deal coalition that was made up of, it was made up of immigrants. It was made up of the urban working class, ethnic minorities. African Americans switched from Republican to Democrat in the 1930s. And so you have a long period of Democratic dominance of the presidency. So if we were to look at, election, graph, elections, U.S. by party. Okay. So, if we were to look at that, like basically between Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon, okay, between Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon, you've only got, so popular vote versus the House seats won by party. Let's take a look here. Party divisions in the Congress even. So when you look at this, there is a long period. Let's see. We're going to let's see. So when you look here, this was a period of Republican dominance. Okay, so you see here the Senate, the House. And then you see here in the 1930s, where with only a few, Eisenhower is going to be the only Republican president. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 2 out of 9 for the Republicans. Now, after that, you see that Republicans have had a pretty strong performance in recent years. So the thing is, when you look at a key election, the 1932 election is very important. And then you could also kind of look as a turning point here. Perhaps that 1994 election seems to have been a turning point in the sense that we see the Republicans definitely, have overperformed in recent, ever since 1994, more often than not, the Republicans have been in control. Like the Democrats have only had 4 years out of the past what, 25 or so, where they have controlled only 2 years where they've controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Okay, so that's something when you're thinking about key elections, that's what you're really looking for, is in terms of what we call a realignment. All right. And yeah, and usually realignment, Raul, is going to be like there's going to be some kind of event. So yeah, it's the president. Now remember, there's something that I like to talk about in terms of, and this is something with y'all got something to write with, something to write on. Okay, so with that, we want to, but yeah, there are other things going on, like there in the 1920s, just a shift to more urban voters as well. It's just one thing about our two-party system, like one party never dominates forever. Like there's always going to be some type of realignment that happens, but credit claiming, okay, which this is something politicians do. Basically, when the economy's bad, it's the president's fault, right? Everybody thinks that. And so the president, when the economy's good, the president will engage in what's called credit claiming. Like I was having a conversation with somebody last week who's not a teacher, but was saying, Donald Trump's always taking credit for the economy. And I'm like, well, there's actually a vocabulary term for that. In my AP government course, we call it credit claiming. And, sometimes I just put on my teacher hat when I'm having conversations with my friends. Now, one thing about the coronavirus is, and what's happening right now, is that is going to have an impact in Trump's ability to claim credit for the economy when people are, not so optimistic right now. So it's going to be very interesting. I'm looking at this election. I'm curious, like, what the coronavirus thing is going to do on two fronts. One of those being the economy as a voting issue and as a strength for Trump. The other, whether it's still like a strength. The other I'm wondering about is, once the dust settles from this coronavirus thing, and we've been like in these, in these whatever quarantines, whatever the social distancing, what is that going to do to American voters? Are we going, and we won't know this for some months, but are American voters going to shift in their attitudes toward border security? Are we going to say, so who knows? Like I think there are just a lot of wild cards right now, but certainly this whole thing is going to have some kind of influence in the presidential election upcoming. So it's going to be fascinating to see what we see there. Now, is there some demand here to talk about the Electoral College? UBI, what are we talking about, Raul? Does anybody, like, when we think about the Electoral College, there was a request on Twitter to go over the Electoral College. Let's see, conventional. Yeah, so I think that Kalia, I think what we're talking about in terms of like conventional versus unconventional political participation, like when we think about conventional political participation, we would be thinking in terms of, we'd be thinking in terms of conventional, like voting, volunteering for a political campaign, and stuff like that. You see, so okay, yeah, universal basic income, yeah. So with that, that's conventional. Like if I'm voting, if I am working with volunteering for a political campaign, I'm phone banking or something like that. Conventional. Okay. Now, the reason why it's called conventional is because it is directly participating in the political process. Whereas when I'm protesting, I'm not, what I'm getting from that, I'd have to look in your book. But what I'm getting from that is we need to understand that, protesting on the basis of an issue or something like that, that can be unconventional political participation. So that's, I don't know how much that's going to be, and it doesn't necessarily go into a I don't see this as a huge exam issue. Now, one thing that you want to note, especially while y'all are self-studying, like, it's one thing to look at your book, but I think that what you want to do is the AP Gov CED, or what they call the CED, the course and exam description. Okay, so what you want to do here is sometimes when there's something in your book, like when I search for the word conventional in the course and exam description, I don't see that come up. Now, convention, that's probably something that will come up. Yes, I do see party of the Constitutional Convention. Probably also something about party conventions. Okay, so when we look for conventions, we're going to see that. So one thing, I would definitely have this link nearby. And when you're reading your book and you're wondering, like you're confused about something, now your teacher may primarily test from the book. And if that's the case, you might need to know that. But if your teacher only gives you like College Board type questions, then you can kind of see by, if you're having trouble with something, open that document up and then like search it for whatever word you're looking for. Find out if it's even like a big exam issue. Okay. Okay, so as far as that goes, let's see here. Now, the difference between a candidate leaning left versus being labeled a progressive or establishment candidate. Now, the left-right thing, when we think about establishment, the establishment of both parties, Ahmed, is the establishment of both parties tends to be closer to the center. Okay, so when you have the establishment, they tend to be leaners. Like an establishment person typically leans left or leans right. Whereas if somebody is a progressive or somebody's a conservative or a depending on what kind of conservative they are, they identify like the president identifies as a nationalist. These are people who don't they're going to be labeled not necessarily as leaning a certain way. So establishment, when we think about establishment, what we're thinking about is the people who control the party organization. So, the Democratic Party, for example, like there is a progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now, the progressives don't really control the Democratic establishment. Because both parties, what we want to understand is that both parties are influenced a lot by major donors. And so when we think about like establishment Republicans, establishment Democrats, they're the ones who are attracting the major donors. They have people in the DNC and the RNC. And so that's what you've seen on the Democratic side. Now, it's interesting when you think about, for example, you saw how a lot of candidates got out of the race and endorsed Biden. So Mayor Pete, or as I call him now, Mayor Yeet, Mayor Pete got out, endorsed Biden. Amy Klobuchar got out, endorsed Biden. Now, Elizabeth Warren stayed in the race for a little longer. Now, Elizabeth Warren personally doesn't get along very well with Bernie Sanders. Now, you see where Elizabeth Warren, she differentiated herself from Bernie. She, during the campaign, she said that I'm not a socialist. I'm a progressive, but I'm not a socialist. I believe in a market economy. So, she said that. Now, of course, she also advocated for a wealth tax, but she's definitely on the progressive side. Now, she held on a little bit. I think she stayed in a little bit longer because she knew it would hurt Bernie. She did her part without saying anything to help Biden on Super Tuesday by staying in the race. But Elizabeth Warren, if she were to, like, she got out of the race, she didn't endorse Biden. Elizabeth Warren can't endorse Joe Biden until it's like clear that he has the nomination. She took a lot of heat, for example, in 2016 because she endorsed Hillary Clinton, before the convention. And I believe it was right before the convention. I forget exactly when, but whenever it was, Bernie supporters felt betrayed because Elizabeth Warren, who has a reputation for being a progressive, endorsed the establishment candidate. Okay, so that's what you want to think about. Like on the Democratic side, is somebody establishment / moderate, or are they progressive? And that's the contest there. Now, Joe Biden, like typically, like very few people think of Joe Biden in terms of being a progressive. Joe Biden is left of center, but people don't typically think of Joe Biden as a progressive. All right. So a lot of stuff there. All right. So we've got that. And we see here, let's see, an example of realignment. On a test, a student Yeah, an example. I would say, Laura, the 1932 presidential election is to me the best example of a realignment election. Like I would focus on that one for realignment because you've got all the drama there. You've got the depression. You've got, where these and what you want to do instead of looking at a bunch of realignment elections, get to know the 1932 election well. Understand that the New Deal coalition has Southern whites, African Americans, ethnic, other ethnic minorities, labor unions, and recent immigrants that lived in cities. And understand that certain parts of that coalition, like, for example, black voters before 1932, tended to support the Republican Party. All right. And so, gerrymandering. Okay, when we get into gerrymandering, and I'm gonna have to cut this off in a little bit because still got another broadcast today. So got to today's like going to be the biggest broadcast day. Otherwise, I've got them kind of segmented out, but I wanted to get everything started today. So government will be. I'll be a little fresher on Thursday. Yeah, so exactly. So, when we look at 1932, that is a realignment of the black electorate from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. All right. And now the thing is, Jonah, I would not necessarily call 1964. Now, teachers, y'all can go 1964. I don't think I'd call it a critical election because look at 1968. Okay. If you want to know whether there was like a critical election or a realignment election, that, yeah, like 1964, Barry Goldwater was trounced. But then we see that what happened, I mean, Lyndon Johnson couldn't even run again 4 years later. So, 1964, even though the Republicans got trounced, it was really the beginning of the conservative movement. When you think about Reagan, only 16 years later in 1980, Reagan had given, now that was the other thing. In 1964, Reagan gave his famous "A Time for Choosing" speech, and where he was speaking in endorsing Barry Goldwater, and Reagan's positions didn't change. So the thing is that Barry Goldwater was like the wrong man for that time. His ideas weren't necessarily timely, but his ideas became a lot more popular and the foundation for today's Republican Party. So yeah, I would say that 1964, like what makes something a critical election is that it changes things for the long term. And I'm not really seeing that with the 1964 election. Now, that was what we would call, if we want an example of a landslide, that's something that I think would be important. But 1932 would be a better example of a critical election because that is basically prompting a long-term realignment. Okay. So as that goes, we've gotten through most of this, and gerrymandering. Let's talk about gerrymandering another time. Now, I've enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed this. I mean, we've had a large enough group. I didn't know if I was going to be in here with 10 people, but we've held over 40, in some cases about 60. Make sure to tell your friends. You can send them the link to sign up for this. I may, go, with some extra, we may do some additional sessions. We'll see. So let's for now though, let's stay in touch. Now, Shaw versus Reno. Skylar, I want to I'll direct you to my YouTube channel. I've got a video on Shaw versus Reno. Okay, so I've recommended Hip Hughes' Iron Triangle video. And so as far as that goes, we want to get into, let's see, Shaw versus Reno, AP Gov. Okay, so that one is, I'll give you a direct link here, and this is a video that I've made recently with my friends at Marco Learning. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. And yeah, so so this is something that directly addresses gerrymandering. And so going into that, that's something there. And yeah, I'm glad I can help you. And I'm definitely glad to see that we've got, that we've got teachers here. I like seeing teachers here contributing to that interaction. Yeah, it's definitely a nice, when you've got like 300, 500 people in there, it's definitely a different vibe. So I will see y'all again. Plan is to see y'all again on Thursday at 4 o'clock. And again, this session will be archived. You can either come back here, or I'm planning to put these on my YouTube channel. All right. Well, yes. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for supporting this, and I will continue to do this for at least the next like 3 weeks, and we'll see how much longer. It is always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.